Awesome. Well, welcome to our advocacy update webinar. I'm Madison Lee, the community outreach coordinator for the Preservation Society. This is a part of our annual Preservation Month, and we have events continuing all throughout the month of May. We are recording this update and will make it available upon request soon. And we do have a moderator monitoring the chat, but as always, feel free to reach out with us with any additional questions after this meeting. Today you'll hear from PSC President and CEO Brian Turner, Director of Advocacy Initiatives, Anna Catherine Alexander, and Director of Public Affairs, Sam Spence. But now I'll pass it off to Brian to kick us off.
Thank you, Madison. It's a pleasure to be here. We had our spring member meeting in person as a reception last week after the James Lima lecture. But I wanted to make sure that our community has an update on everything that we're doing as an advocacy team. And we're going to address that today in 3 key questions that we get and have some presentations. So first, I just want to acknowledge our incredible team at the Preservation Society. We have 16 full-time staff here between our retail shop, our advancement division, and our advocacy team. And we have just an incredible brain trust of people to connect with. And so at the end of the presentation, we're going to have some contacts where you can get in touch and have your questions answered. But we're really fortunate to have such an incredible team. So I wanted to start with a few reflections on James Lima from last week. For those of you who missed it, it was our 2nd annual Elizabeth Kirkland Cahill Distinguished Lecture at the Charleston Music Hall, and there was a great crowd on the topic of building great public places. James's remarks were highly relevant to what Charleston is seeing. We have many major projects on the horizon. Undoubtedly, these will have major impacts on the city's livability. Think Ashley Landing, Magnolia Landing, West Edge, the Navy Yard, Laurel Island, Courier Square, the Low Line, the Extended Battery, Union Pier. And that's in addition to all of the projects that are currently entitled but haven't yet broken ground. Many of them, unfortunately for us, are new hotel buildings. We have taken a really hard line against some of these, but regardless, you're going to hear about some of these today. And James really gave us a roadmap and talked about success stories and how we can leverage public benefits with these largely private realm projects. And how the public and private sectors can work together to make equality and inclusive public realm improvements. His talk it was followed by a conversation with our PSC board chair, Andy Gowder, touching on critical questions about how public benefits can be created within the context of new development, and especially by appealing to economic data, which shows that public spaces like parks and trails really actually add economic value to places. He reminded us that asking the right questions at the outset of a project can help minimize harm to vulnerable communities. Asking, who are these places for? What are the benefits for the broader community? And we've been doing a lot of thinking internally on the question of what role the Preservation Society can best play to make these big projects coming our way more resilient, better quality, and contextual with such a unique historic city. Zoning is an imperfect tool, but we have historically used it in Charleston to constrain harmful impulses. Poor design and non-sympathetic massing has real impacts on our city's character. And take Union Pier, for example. It's still unclear what zoning path the new owners will elect. But one thing that's clear from our initial conversations with the team is that the approvals should be a confirmation of uses and ideas that are carefully vetted, not a last-minute surprise. A good process there will be far more important for us than the actual zoning vehicle that's elected. Let's see here. There we go. Okay, I want to touch on the federal context for a minute. We're going to largely dwell on the local, but there have been some things happening at the federal level. We're part of a network of preservation organizations across the country that are leveraging our impacts as stewards of historic places to ensure that our public lands and historic federal buildings remain well funded in a time where a lot of budgets are being cut, and that our state preservation offices can function effectively with our federal partners. Key federal laws that we rely on, like the National Historic Preservation Act, are really important for the future of our historic places. And we want those commitments made by Congress to be taken seriously by federal agencies. So you'll see here our partnership with Preservation Action. It's currently a really critical time on the Hill in terms of what funding levels are going to be approved for historic preservation programs that go to states. And also the historic tax credit is going to be under consideration. Senator Tim Scott in South Carolina has a really key role as a leader on the Senate Finance Committee. And so we encourage our members to reach out and talk about how important preservation is for their community. I also wanted to mention that the Partners Network group met in Asheville recently to talk about some preservation issues, both nationally, but as well what happens when natural disaster strikes your community, learning from the LA Conservancy about what they've been through and the Preservation Society of Asheville and Buncombe County. I think were worthwhile conversations. Any and all time thinking about our preparedness here in Charleston is time well spent. And I would remind those who haven't seen our resilience guidance for Charleston to check it out. It's a great resource that we continue to build a knowledge base and a brain trust on. Our staff have also been busy in the field talking here about the Mapping Charleston's Black Burial Grounds initiative, both at a statewide conference and here locally. This is a project we intend to continue building out, and I think is really being impactful both locally as well as at the national level for sort of a prototype on how we can extend our knowledge and awareness of an underrepresented part of Charleston's history. Now I'm going to move on to our programming for today. I mentioned at the outset, we're going to be talking about three key questions that we get frequently in our work in the field, and we're going to take them in stride. First, we're going to talk about big buildings in a sensitive context. What's with all these big buildings? Second, we're going to talk about neighborhood preservation. And to close out, we're going to talk about impacts of sprawl on our rural communities and structure these conversations with Preservation Society staff who have great knowledge and awareness of these issues. So let's get started. What's with all these Anywhere USA buildings? We're going to put some links in the chat that we frequently use as staff to track these issues. As large-scale buildings pop up, and especially on the peninsula, we frequently get the question about what led to their approvals. We're going to have Sam Spence and Anna Catherine Alexander answer this in as simple terms as possible in the first part of the program. But to get started, I just want to mention that Charleston is guided by a 10-year comprehensive plan, and that's probably one of our most frequented references besides the actual text of the zoning code itself, as we see big projects come on the horizon. There is a cultural resources component in that city plan, which is authorized by state law. It's actually required by state law. And that has the important provisions in it about these buildings meeting our other policy goals, being having a process to make them contextual with what's already here. A city that has such a distinctive sense of place is obviously facing some massive pressures, and zoning really is how these demands have been and will be managed, with a central purpose of creating predictability. So Anna Catherine is going to start us off to discuss a few examples that help put this in context.
Thank you, Brian. And yes, I'm Anna Catherine. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. Just to jump from where Brian left us, in light of the increasing demand that we're experiencing as a community, we have observed several trends, and one in particular is developers seeking more than allowed under existing zoning. That's more height, more square footage, more density, more intense uses. And so, in tandem with the comprehensive plan, the city's zoning ordinance is intended to create predictability and contextual growth. And the Preservation Society is often in the position of pushing back on the piecemeal imposition of new rules. So, to take the Four Seasons Hotel at Meeting Street and Horlbeck Alley as a specific example, this approved 8-story, 150 room hotel is a product of several asks for more. First, the project required planning commission approval for 2 rezoning requests, one for more height up to 7 stories, and one for density from a 50 hotel room allowance to 150. And then there was an ask for an additional 8th story for architectural merit from the BAR, which was also approved. And this is a dynamic that is really important to answering the questions that we often field about how something that seems out of context with its surroundings ever got approved in the first place. So, in short, the zoning ordinance establishes the framework for what gets built. And this is a map of the city of Charleston's base zoning district that generally defines land use tailored to specific areas. So as you can see here, this is not a one size fits all approach, and is something that should be adhered to on a regular basis. And as you zoom in on the peninsula, you can see that in addition to regulating land use, the zoning ordinance also designates height districts that are measured in stories. And if you're tuning in with us for the first time, I'm sorry to say that the commonly shared sentiment that in Charleston buildings can't be taller than church steeples is just not true. um, Between 2015 and 2017, the height districts were carefully restudied to determine corridors that could handle taller buildings and to ensure a sensitive transition to smaller scale areas. And you can see here on this map, although it's granular, a few areas where 8 stories are allowed along Upper King and Meeting Streets, which are also historically high ground. And one special base zoning district to note that ties use and height together and is the area where we're seeing the tallest buildings rise on the peninsula is the Upper Peninsula Zoning District, which is an incentive-based district that offers height and density bonuses all the way up to 12 stories in exchange for added community benefits like workforce housing, open space, green infrastructure, and other things that you can see listed here. And we'll look at a few examples of buildings in the Upper Peninsula District in just a moment. But in addition to looking at a property's base zoning district, its height district, it's also important to look at any overlay districts that may apply to a property when you're thinking about how it could be developed. So one that comes into play often is the accommodations overlay, which Brian touched on just a moment ago, which establishes the boundaries for where new hotels can be located. And when a property is in the overlay, the next step is to seek Board of Zoning Appeals approval for a hotel use. And this board is tasked with making sure that new accommodation proposals meet the criteria in the ordinance. But the Planning Commission and City Council can also approve requests for properties outside of the overlay to opt in. And given the pressure for new hotels and impacts on affordability and diversity of use, the PSC is consistently opposed to piecemeal expansion of the accommodations overlay zone, which Sam will talk about in just a moment. But first, let's take a look at some of the fastest growing areas on the peninsula to see in real time how zoning is shaping our buildings. So first, now that we've covered that overview, in the Upper Peninsula District that we just talked about, Morrison Yard is a development that has raised a lot of questions in recent years for its sheer size. Not only is this in the Upper Peninsula District where up to 12 stories are allowed, but a portion of this site was also rezoned for inclusion in the accommodations overlay back in 2021, which was a move the PSC opposed. And so in addition to what we see now, which is an existing office building, an apartment complex, a 10-story, 250-room hotel is also on the horizon for this site after receiving BZA and BAR approval last year. So this is certainly an area of the peninsula where we're seeing a lot of activity. It's a place to watch. And another similar scenario to illustrate how all of these various facets of our zoning impact how this area is taking shape is the proposed hotel at 245 Hugie and 590 Meeting Street, which is also located in the Upper Peninsula District and also was rezoned into the accommodations overlay through approvals in 2019 and 2022. And after receiving BZA approval for a 150-room hotel, this design got a conceptual okay from the BAR Large this spring, as you can see here. And we appreciate that this proposal steps down to 4 stories at the corner of Meeting and Hugie, which is the corner we're looking at here. But this process really illustrates that by the time a proposal reaches the BAR, so much is already baked in. And this is something that we're constantly having to speak to as we're answering questions about how buildings are approved. And lastly, just to throw a wrench in things, a third rail for how major development takes shape is the planned unit development or HUD route that Brian mentioned earlier. And PUDs are an amendment to the city's zoning map and lock in key zoning criteria like permitted uses, open space, lot standards. And an example to watch as this year progresses is Courier Square Phase 3 on the site of the old Post and Courier building that recently was approved for demolition. And this PUD was approved by City Council in 2023, and we can anticipate design review by the BAR as early as this summer. And as you can see here, that will include building heights that range from 3 to 12 stories. We'll also see a mix of uses, including residential, retail, and a hotel. So we show all of these examples to illustrate how zoning impacts the way that development takes shape in the city. So now I'll pass it to Sam for more on the question of how this type of development takes shape.
Thanks a lot, Anna Catherine. I'm Sam Spence, the Director of Public Affairs, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how the factors and situations that Anna Catherine described kind of make it into how we talk about these things with folks. The factors that influence building design are pretty complicated, and they're multifaceted and range from efficiency to commercial lending to costs of materials, speed, and more. This New York Times story from a few years ago, you might recognize it. One of those factors, it pointed out that a number of the multifamily projects around the U.S. are starting to be undertaken by a smaller number of companies. And so that may be one reason why you might see similar designs across many different cities, many different markets. In Charleston, it's helpful to think about this in terms of managing demand and growth and how those different forces kind of manifest here in Charleston. Ultimately, in Charleston, we have to deal with both of these factors, and they're obviously very closely connected. And ultimately, what we see come through the processes here are as a result of market trends and market forces that put pressure on our land use and planning decisions. Now, Brian spoke earlier about the commitment to design excellence and the commitment to architectural detail here in Charleston. And over time, these pressures can put stresses on those high standards that we have here in Charleston. And we see those pressures through development, yes, as well as increased strain from industries like tourism. And just a note, if you see down at the bottom, these two stories, which are a little bit different, one's about development, one's about travel traffic, are day apart from each other earlier this year. And so that's just to kind of show you how these things are both connected. With increased strain on development, businesses in terms of construction costs and land costs and more, we're seeing a desire, as Anna Catherine mentioned, to max out property values. And that's just one of the reasons why we're seeing more and more hotels in recent years. This is one example of a hotel that was proposed recently on Meeting Street, just outside the accommodations overlay, but near where there had been several other piecemeal additions to the accommodations overlay in the past. You can see on the map with the radius, the site proposed for the hotel is in green in the center, and the blue buildings are sites where there are accommodations approvals on paper, and where the new hotels essentially could be built. And the folks in the green box there were asking for additional approval to build another one on Upper Meeting Street there. And the Preservation Society opposed this proposal at Planning Commission along with others, and ultimately the Planning Commission agreed with us. And this project has since been withdrawn. So how do we hear about these things? How do things come across our desks? You all see the yellow BAR signs or the red rezoning signs all over the city, and we hear about some things from those avenues sometimes. But then we also monitor pretty closely a lot of state public notice websites. We recently got wind of a major demolition on Morrison Drive for the ILA Hall through a newspaper notice from the Department of Environmental Services. And then also the city publishes their routine over the desk BAR reviews periodically as well. And so we kind of keep an eye on all these different pieces to kind of form our priorities as we move forward. We also meet with project teams, whether on site, before BAR meetings, and then we really try to prioritize consistency in our public communications about these projects. After we meet with the teams, after we are pretty upfront about how we feel about these projects a lot of times, and managing consistency in our public communications, as well as our communications with project teams as it relates to goals and expectations, not only helps us build relationships in the community, but also ensure we're being as efficient as we can, excuse me. One method that you all might have seen that we've used in recent years to be effective in our communication has been the use of 3D renderings. This is a visual you can see of the proposed Union Pier project from a couple years ago that showed the proposed project's possible impact on the Ansonboro neighborhood. This is an aerial looking over the rooftops of Ansonboro toward what was the initial Union Pier project. This project has kind of since taken a pause and stepped back, and these proposals are no longer under consideration. We took several different data points of this project and used them in our public communications. Used them to try to drive home the message that this project could have a pretty outsized impact on Charleston's historic neighborhoods. And Catherine spoke earlier about the Four Seasons project on Meeting Street. This is an animated rendering showing the project as it is now, the days in, and then kind of toggling into what's being proposed as the Four Seasons, much larger map than we're all used to driving by there on Meeting Street. Here's one that's under consideration or could be under consideration right now. This is a potential parking garage for consideration on Wentworth Street at St. Philip Street. This project has not gone before a public body yet, just full disclosure. So this is just for conceptual purposes only. Many times we commission these 3D renderings as a way to depict projects so that the renderings that people see in project files and in BAR packets and things like that are not the only things that are available for folks to have a reference for. And so these kind of are attempting to show the on the ground impacts or the relative impacts to the historic neighborhoods that they are adjacent to. So what do we see in our kind of advocacy that helps projects be successful? And in our experience, there are a few conditions that can help ensure a successful project. All the local and regional planning that we're talking about today is enabled by state laws that grant local governments the ability to set ground rules for their communities. It lays the groundwork for local zoning, has prompted discussion. It lays the groundwork for local zoning and has prompted discussion more recently about how local governments can ensure development does not outpace infrastructure. Anyone who knows and watches how communities grow successfully can tell you that a strong focus on high quality design is also essential. From building materials that are compatible with historic development to the way roads and streets create new public spaces, this is one of the driving factors in Charleston's preservation movement, and is something that local governments all over the country try to emulate. And human scale design that feels welcoming and appropriate for its context is one of the qualities of a place that you notice most, even if just subconsciously. And quality design and human scale are two key factors in driving the final one, activating and serving the community with new uses. Activating places and that add to the quality of life and organic function of a community, like parks and places that feel welcoming, new businesses that fill needs in the community, and institutions that can serve the community's common good are all kind of things we look for and things that we see as common factors in successful developments. It's hardest to get these four factors right on larger projects, and one of them is under construction right now that we're hopeful will deliver on these factors is the Courier Square Phase 2 project, which is underway right now on King Street between Columbus and Lion Streets. This is a rendering that shows how a quality design that can enliven a streetscape with new public spaces. And I have to point out that this final design came about as a result of continued advocacy by the Preservation Society and others, and was ultimately decided on after an initial design was denied by the BAR. So with that, I want to kick it back to Madison to keep us going.
Yeah, so preserving neighborhoods is just as important as promoting new development with good design. They're two sides of the same coin. The idea is that if we push for new buildings and growth to be well designed, we also have a responsibility to care and care for and protect existing historic places. We're seeing this in a lot of communities outside of Charleston's Peninsula that are pushing for this very preservation, like Liberty Hill in North Charleston and the old Windermere neighborhood in West Ashley. And it brings up this question that we get quite often: how do I know if something is beyond repair? So I'm going to kind of let Anna Catherine dive more into that.
Thank you, Madison. Yes, this is definitely a question that we know many homeowners have, and it's central to the question of neighborhood preservation and the challenge of neighborhood preservation. It's also the question of whether something is beyond repair is the common defense of the well-meaning contractors who end up back before the Board of Architectural Review because perhaps they've removed more material than permitted. As you've seen in our communications, a lot of after the fact requests for demolition or partial demolition that have come before the Board of Architectural Review. And unfortunately, the assumption is too often that material is beyond repair and that no one will A, notice or B, care if it's removed and replaced. But the fact is that people do care, and it does matter. All environmental and preservation law is really based on the precautionary principle of stop and look and listen, because once it's gone, you can't get it back. And on the peninsula, the BAR process, we're very fortunate to have this as a vehicle that's set up to promote thoughtful action. In keeping with federal preservation standards, it's set up to prioritize repair rather than replacement and provide residents and homeowners with a pathway for support from BAR staff and board members in determining what can and can't be saved. And when defining demolition, our zoning ordinance takes into account the value of individual features. It talks about roofs, columns, chimneys, siding, doors, shutters, and other unique architectural features, which, to quote the ordinance, if lost, would compromise the historic architectural character of the structure. So when we talk about demolition, it's the features. It's not just the total loss of a building, although as we saw in some of the photographs here that we're showing, sometimes removal is death by 1,000 cuts and does result in total demolition of a building. So this touches on one of the main reasons why maintaining historic material matters, and it's about protecting the character of a structure and the neighborhood. The unique handcrafted quality of historic elements can't be reproduced. They have aesthetic and cultural value, and the difference is discernible. But something we want to drive home is that there are numerous other benefits of historic materials that we want property owners in neighborhoods, both with and without BAR regulation, to consider. So first, historic materials are not only aesthetically and culturally valuable, but they're incredibly durable. Just to use wood as an example, here's an example of new versus historic material quality. So old growth wood, which we can see here on the left, refers to wood that has grown very slowly over a long period of time. It's very hard to come by nowadays. We used a lot of it in the past, and it results in what you see here is these tight growth rings and dense wood that's less susceptible to rot and warp. Whereas today we have newer lumber that's sourced from timber companies that prioritize quick production with far lesser qualities. And the saying that they don't make them like they used to really holds true here. So we're always trying to reinforce to property owners just this inherent durable quality of historic materials. Secondly, historic materials are intended by nature to be maintained and repaired for maximum longevity. In a lot of ways, Charleston was preserved by default. That's something you've probably heard before, is that people didn't have the money to replace things, so they repaired them. And today, cheaper replacement options are plentiful. So it's important to understand that the life cycle costs of replacing high quality, durable materials with synthetic products that were never meant to last, they're very high. And siding and windows and other products that are made from older, higher quality wood are performing well 100 years or more into their lifespan across the city. We see the evidence of this everywhere. Meanwhile, most brand new windows that are installed today can be better categorized as 10 or 20 or 30-year band-aids. And there's a real difference there. There's also the benefit of environmental sustainability. Avoiding needless removal of repairable material means less waste in landfills, and also no fossil fuels required for production of a replacement product. There's a lot to consider here when thinking about the footprint and the impact of just tossing something out to replace it with something new. And lastly, we encourage homeowners to really do their homework on energy savings that are promised by manufacturers in favor of replacing historic materials. We hear this argument a lot that when it comes to windows in particular, so we're kind of focusing on that. And really, utility data shows that only 40% of energy use in the average American home comes from heating and cooling, and that on average, windows are the culprit of only 10% of energy loss. So you can see all of these other areas where energy is lost through the envelope of a building. So the payback on new windows may not be as appealing as promised, but this also applies to things like roofing and siding and other historic materials, but just some food for thought for property owners. And homeowners and contractors and members of the design and construction community, all of us have a really important role in this, in determining if something is beyond repair. It requires careful documentation and consultation with professionals, including the BAR, preservation professionals like us at the Preservation Society, and qualified contractors and tradespeople. We're so fortunate in Charleston to have such a wide community of people who are educated in this field and are able and willing to help. And it really does require collaboration and good, transparent communication. And while repair techniques are learned skills, they're also simple and attainable. And Charleston has been and must continue to be a leader in equipping professionals and property owners alike to steward our historic buildings. So at the Preservation Society, we're really working to do our part in this by a few things. First, partnering with neighborhoods to document what makes their neighborhood special. In 2023 and 2024, the Preservation Society and Historic Charleston Foundation interns jointly produced the Wagner Terrace Area Character Appraisal. And this gives residents language and documentation to speak to the elements and features that make their neighborhood unique. This resource was actually formally accepted by the BAR in 2024, and we have a similar project underway right now in collaboration with the North Central neighborhood that we're really excited to launch later this year. We also work to provide guidance for homeowners on preventative maintenance and best practices through our BAR advocacy. As Brian and Sam mentioned, we're constantly in communication with project professionals and homeowners. And also, as we touched on, our resilience guidance is an incredibly practical resource for approaching maintenance and repair for your historic building or just your property in general. Provides a lot of DIY solutions to help make some of these repairs that may seem out of the realm of possibility for a property owner much more attainable. And lastly, it's also critically important to support building trades professionals and programs like the American College of the Building Arts, who are engaging broader audiences and equipping the next generation of skilled craftsmen who will ultimately carry on Charleston's legacy of stewardship. So these are just a few ways that we're working to bridge that education gap and to bring others into the fold and see themselves as preservationists and stewards. So I'll now pass it to Madison to lead us into our final question of the day.
Yeah, so thank you, Anna Catherine. As we've discussed, advocacy and education on the value of historic places matter even more outside of BAR purview. Rural communities like Red Top or Hamlin Beach are feeling the pressure of regional growth. So we often get this question, how can we protect our rural communities from increasing sprawl? So I'll let Brian kind of talk more to that.
I'm going to start and I'm going to hand it off to Sam. As many of you know, our work is not limited to the Charleston Peninsula. One of the real advantages, I think, of our Centennial campaign in 2020 was to allow us a chance to double down on our efforts, not only on the peninsula where we have things like BAR regulations, but to look at communities that are increasingly aging and vulnerable to population growth. And have historic resources, but really have no mechanism at the local level, or have newer mechanisms like in the case of Charleston County, but that haven't really been tested. So we sent an email out earlier this year that got a lot of traction on 3 threatened rural resources in Charleston that I think have some good context for this discussion. A house on Folly Beach, a house on Wadmalaw Island, and a former Rosenwald school, and a threatened site, which you'll be hearing more about, the Tobin Boyd School in the Red Top community. And in each of these situations, the factual circumstances are very different, but the commonality is that we have historic resources in our rural communities that are in need of protection and yet don't have that. They don't have a mechanism for the local jurisdiction to protect them. So just a little bit of context before I turn it over to Sam. About 270,000 people are expected to move to the Tri-County area within the next 10 to 15 years. That's larger than the combined populations of City of Charleston and North Charleston. It's a tremendous amount of growth that we are anticipating here. And this question, I would posit, is only going to get more important because a lot of these pockets of growth are being targeted for places like Berkeley County, Dorchester County. And as I mentioned, we don't have preservation ordinances there. So if it's not an easement, we have to think very creatively about how we're going to protect these places. I would note that as much as we talk and we support missing middle and denser housing projects, a lot of people come with their expectations from other places. They live in a rural community there. They want a single family home here. It's sort of part of this American dream. And so how can we address these modern demands, the need for greater protections with the reality and plan for a future that's better and protects against the impacts of sprawl. So now I'll turn it over to Sam Spence to dive in a little further.
Thanks a lot, Brian. Yeah, it's a good setup for continuing this conversation. And like Brian said, we've been pretty excited in recent years to see that other local governments um, around the Charleston area have become more active in devising tools to help protect the patterns of development that affect rural communities. The map that you're looking at now is a map of Charleston County with all the different municipal boundaries overlain on it. So you can see kind of all the complex overlapping jurisdictions that that individual municipalities have to account for, and that's not even accounting for fast-growing areas like the Cainhoy Peninsula, where Daniel Island is, and Dorchester County, which includes a lot of Somerville. We'll hear a little bit more about the county's efforts, which kind of began most recently with a 2016 countywide survey that takes kind of an inventory of a lot of the cultural resources in unincorporated areas, so not subject to individual cities or towns' jurisdictions when it comes to the zoning and planning issues you may hear about in, say, the city of Charleston. These are rural resources in unincorporated areas of the Charleston County. And then just to kind of point to the fact that this is a fast developing issue, this is a story in the newspaper or online at least today, just a couple hours ago, that talks about how Mount Pleasant is taking note of efforts underway in Charleston County. We all know how complex kind of jurisdictional lines are east of the Cooper, many unincorporated areas right up against rural unincorporated areas right up against fast developing suburban development in Mount Pleasant. So you can see where the town of Mount Pleasant is taking note of what the county is attempting to do in their unincorporated areas. These cultural landscapes are a testament to historic settlement patterns in communities like 10 Mile, Phillips, Hamlin Beach, which Madison mentioned earlier, and that's east of the Cooper, and then Beefield on James Island. These are the four communities that have availed themselves of new protections that the county provides to create new historic districts that provide some additional level of protection and review at the county level. But it's more than about preservation in these areas. Is about more than just kind of the bricks and mortar. It's about and the materials. It's about community survival in the face of increasing pressures. The reality is that being a historic community, though, doesn't automatically ensure protections. It takes a lot of work. Here you're seeing an aerial of the Phillips community, which was which was the first county designated historic district east of the Cooper. And so, working with community leaders, we work to support efforts through complicated and sometimes time-consuming and new, like Brian said, public review processes that have to do with their communities as districts or individual projects on individual sites within their communities. Here is a 1920 USGS map showing the Red Top community, which is as we know it today, kind of just outside of suburban West Ashley at the end of Bees Ferry Road, off north and south of Highway 17. So we work to identify and make the most of opportunities where these communities, which are vibrant and continual, with many descendant families continuing to inhabit these communities and make the most of the tools where they do exist. Red Top, which you see some photos of here, is not one of the county designated districts yet, but they are very active and are currently working on putting the elements together to put forth their own nomination. And so we make the case with each of these instances as to why we want to see more added protections, not just in the existing districts, but countywide and really outside of Charleston County. But we're just using Charleston County as an example here today. The picture you're looking at here is a picture of the Tobin Boyd Elementary School. It's a red top, a historic red top elementary school that was opened in 1961. It was one of the last segregated schools to open in Charleston County, 1961. And it's what's called an equalization school. There was an article in the Post and Courier last week about efforts to continue to preserve the Tobin Boyd School. And it's really an understudied resource type. There have been a lot in the Charleston area. There were many across downtown and in outlying areas that were built during the time when schools were still segregated through the 1960s. Um, and one of the tools here, you see some other news clips of Tobin Boyd School being open and students working in Tobin Boyd School. Um, and this brings us kind of to one new facet of our advocacy here is that we know our friends in the conservation world have been looking at uh, Department of Environmental Services, DHEC, formerly DHEC, permits for a long time to make their work possible. Um, and this is kind of something that's coming across our radar as well now too, as more and more projects in outlying areas that have not yet been developed are seeking coastal zone consistency permits and permits to build in former wetland areas or current wetland areas. And so we've been working for a long time to make the connection between these permits and cultural resources that are threatened as a result of increased development in areas where these permits are needed. And so currently on the Tobin Boyd School, for example, we're working with the State Historic Preservation Office to make sure these reviews do continue to include cultural resources, and we're learning more about this process. This is uh, in absence of any concrete county or other local protections that make these kinds of purviews even more important. Now, county designation, here's a shot from county council chambers. County designation is an important tool for preservation in rural areas, and it does confer an added level of review for development projects like subdivision and even some limited design review. We mentioned that Red Top is working through the process for added protection. Other communities, like I mentioned, that have implemented local protection successfully are the Phillips community, which was the first county designated district, as well as the first Gullah Geechee settlement community added to the federally managed National Register of Historic Places. And in 10 Mile, which is near Phillips, here's a shot from the state office after the National Register nomination was approved by the state. Um, and in 10 Mile, which is near Phillips, it's another historic district community. Increased scrutiny of the impacts of subdivisions in these areas within historic district communities have made local leaders take notice at the county level, where a temporary moratorium has been passed that limits major subdivisions in these areas. And another historic district nearby, the Hamlin Beach community, along with Red Top, are all part of the Gullah Geechee Heritage Preservation Project, which is managed by the city of Charleston, but it's working to identify new resources in Gullah Geechee descendant communities. And we know that there will be some exciting new developments in these communities in the near future. Here is some work underway in Red Top to finalize their area character appraisal, which will amplify their protections under their historic district protection. So with that, I want to send it back over to Madison to wrap us up.
Yeah, so I did want to mention our remaining Preservation Month events. Tomorrow we have a hard hat tour at 65 South Street. I know some spots are limited, so get those while you can. There's also the Steeples of the Holy City lecture on May 27th, and then we are concluding Preservation Month by teaming up with the Marsh Project for a backyard resilience workshop on May 31st. So we hope to see you there if you could make it. And it's been a pleasure enjoying Preservation Month with you guys. Brian, any last remarks?
Yeah, I think I'm just gonna close on a couple comments. Thank you all, first of all, for actively spending your lunch hour with us. It's really important. And I hope a couple things from this webinar. First of all, one of the things I like the most about being with this organization is that we are a membership, and we're a membership in a way that is not just people join us not just for name only. It's not nominal. You all are very active and engaged in your communities. And so I hope some of what was presented today are things you can take to your community and sort of spread the word on how things are structured and how we can be a force for good change. The other thing that just have to say, in an age where there's a lot of polarization in our communities, preservation is something that is very much a big tent movement, that we are honoring histories that are not only ours, but our communities, sort of shared heritage. And the tools that we've developed within this movement are being utilized by people of all stripes in all different communities throughout the country. And it's really, it's just a privilege to be a part of this. And so I just want to thank everyone out there for being a part of us, for being an engaged member. And I hope we see you, as Madison mentioned, at some of our upcoming events and on into the fall. Our next gathering will be our annual meeting in October. And so thank you for your commitment to the Preservation Society. And thanks for joining us today.